There comes a moment in every life, a sacred pause when the noise must cease. And it is in that moment, in that deep, holy stillness that the transformation begins. Oh, how many words we speak! How much noise fills the air, rattling through the chambers of our minds and souls. We argue, we explain, we justify. We plead to be understood, but listen to me. Listen with your spirit. There is a power that is birthed not in shouting but in will. What happens to a man when you go silent? He must finally hear his own voice. Does something to him, it awakens. There is no mirror more honest than the silence of a person who once spoke with love. There is no thunder louder than the absence of a voice that once whispered wisdom, compassion, and warning. Silence is not weakness, it's power restrained. To the world, silence is often mistaken for passivity, for surrender, for lack of courage or voice. People equate volume with strength, as though only the loudest in the room are the ones who are winning. But deep, unshakable power does not need to announce itself. It doesn't need applause, it doesn't seek validation. Power, real power, is often veiled in stillness, cloaked in calm, and expressed not in thunder but in restraint. There is a kind of strength that roars without noise. It is the kind that walks away when provoked. It is the kind that refuses to feed the fire when the argument demands more fuel. It is the kind that chooses peace over dominance, stillness over retaliation, discernment over impulse. And that strength is not born out of fear, but out of deep mastery. It comes from knowing who you are, knowing what you carry, and refusing to waste it on battles that do not deserve you. Silence is the armor of the disciplined. It's the refuge of the spiritually awake. Anyone can lash out. Anyone can retaliate. Anyone can let their mouth run wild when their ego is bruised or their feelings are hurt. But it takes a greater soul to hold its tongue when insulted, to step back when challenged, and to remain composed when chaos surrounds. That's not weakness. That's supreme power under control. When you choose silence, you are not giving up your power. You are guarding it. You are placing it in a vault, choosing to release it only when it serves purpose, not when it serves pride. This kind of restraint confuses those who feed off reaction. It disarms those who thrive on emotional chaos. It frustrates those who believe that pushing your buttons will give them control over your peace. And in that frustration, they begin to see you differently. They begin to recognize that what they thought was vulnerability is actually untouchable authority. They begin to feel the weight of your presence. Not because you spoke, but because you didn't. They begin to reckon with their own noise, because your silence acts as a mirror. It reflects. It reveals. It unmasks. You don't need to scream to be heard. You don't need to argue to be right. You don't need to retaliate to prove you are strong. Your silence is not an absence of voice. It's the presence of self-control. And self-control is a language only the spiritually mature can speak fluently. Sometimes silence is the strongest boundary you can draw. It says, I will not entertain what depletes me. It says, I have chosen my peace over your chaos. It says, you do not have the power to pull me out of alignment. And that is not cowardice. That is not avoidance. That is clarity. That is command. That is knowing when to stand firm and when to walk away with dignity. There is a reason the wise speak less. There is a reason the calm are the ones who hold the room. Because people sense when someone has power they don't need to prove. That kind of energy cannot be faked. It's cultivated through trial. It's refined through pain. It's tested in moments where reaction would be easier. But the soul chooses silence instead. In your silence, a man confronts himself. When your voice is no longer present to fill the space, to soothe, to correct, to guide, something begins to shift in the unseen. The absence becomes its own presence. The stillness begins to speak louder than words ever could. It echoes in the chambers of his conscience, pressing against the places where truth has been ignored, avoided, or denied. Your silence removes the shield, and what remains is an unfiltered reflection of who he is when no one is speaking on his behalf. So long as you are speaking, defending, explaining, forgiving, pleading, he can continue to lean on your voice as a crutch, as a covering. But when you withdraw your words, he is left with no option but to sit with the truth. The silence becomes a mirror, and what it reveals is often uncomfortable. It is not your silence that causes the discomfort. It is the exposure it brings. A man who once relied on your compassion, your presence, your ability to cushion reality, suddenly finds himself without that emotional anchor. It's not punishment, it's permission. Permission for him to see, maybe for the first time, the impact of his choices. Without your voice to filter or soften the blow, the consequences are experienced raw and unfiltered. It is in that rawness that accountability can begin. Silence doesn't attack, but it confronts. It forces the internal dialogue to rise. The mind begins to revisit conversations, trace decisions, question motives. Things long buried beneath the noise of everyday life begin to stir in the quiet. And whether he wants to or not, he must face the man in the mirror. The silence becomes sacred space, where excuses fall apart and truth rises. And it is not only what is heard in the silence, but what is felt. The absence of your presence, your affirmation, your insight, it creates a void that only honesty can fill. He cannot run to the comfort of your reassurance. He cannot hide behind your empathy. All that is left is him, and the weight of what has been left unsaid. That weight can be crushing or it can be awakening. Often it is both. It's not that your silence causes harm. It's that your silence reveals harm that was already there. Harm that was being ignored, minimized, or misunderstood. When you were speaking, it was easier for him to remain blind. But in the silence, his eyes begin to open. Sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully. But undeniably, the mind may wander at first. The ego may resist. He may convince himself that your silence means indifference or coldness. But deep down, in that place beyond pride, he knows better. He begins to feel the truth he couldn't hear when you were still talking. He begins to recognize how much your words once carried and how different the world feels without them. And that realization, if he allows it, will shape him. Because the soul cannot lie in silence. The distractions fade, the projections dissolve, and all that remains is what he sees when no one is looking, no one is explaining, and no one is justifying on his behalf. It is in that place, in that sacred confrontation, that a man is given the rare opportunity to meet himself face to face and choose who he wants to become. Words can shield, but silence reveals. There's a strange safety in conversation. Even in confrontation, words, when spoken often and quickly, can act as walls, layers of distraction, justification, and control. They protect not just the speaker but also the listener from facing the raw, unvarnished reality that lies underneath. We talk to defend ourselves, to soften the truth, to avoid pain, and sometimes to control how others perceive us. In many ways, words can become a veil, but silence, pure and intentional, has no veil. It offers nothing to hide behind. When words are stripped away, there is no buffer between a person and their truth. There's no explanation to manipulate the moment, no carefully chosen phrasing to lessen the impact. Silence removes the filters. It doesn't try to make anything easier, and in doing so, it invites the reality of things to surface. Without the cover of conversation, people begin to see what was always there, but hidden beneath the flow of dialogue. This is why silence is so uncomfortable for some. It's not the quiet that unsettles them. It's what the quiet makes visible. It's the look in your eyes that can't be explained away, the energy in the room that words can no longer distract from. When you stop speaking, you stop managing the narrative, and that forces others to sit with their own. What was once covered becomes revealed. What was once easy to overlook becomes undeniable. People often rely on words to control outcomes. They talk their way into being understood, into being forgiven, into avoiding consequences. But when you go silent, all that effort collapses. Silence removes the usual escape routes. And when someone can no longer escape through argument, persuasion, or charm, they have to finally face what they've been avoiding. That's when masks begin to fall. That's when postures start to shift. That's when the real self begins to emerge, stripped of performance, stripped of defense, stripped of excuses. The truth is, we often speak too quickly, trying to fix things that aren't ready to be fixed. We try to rescue people from truths they haven't yet admitted. But silence does something else. It waits. It doesn't push. It doesn't manipulate. It doesn't interrupt the necessary process of recognition. It allows the weight of reality to settle in its proper place. And that's where the revelation happens. Not because you said something new or louder or more powerful, but because you said nothing. And in that nothingness, the full impact of what has happened, or what was lost, or what must change is finally felt. Words might soften the edges, but silence forces the sharpness of truth to cut where it needs to. And though it may hurt, that pain can be the beginning of healing. That discomfort can be the beginning of awareness. Silence doesn't accuse, but it exposes. It doesn't chase, but it confronts. It doesn't argue, but it convicts, not by force, but by absence, not by volume, but by stillness. And in that stillness, the soul begins to stir, the mind begins to question, the heart begins to remember. Silence is not passive, it is precise. It shows what words often try to cover. It points to what truly matters, not what's said, but what's lived, what's felt, what's known deep down beneath the surface. It's in the silence that intentions are seen, that consequences are realized, that realities are understood. Words can delay that process, but silence brings it forward unmistakably and often uncomfortably. Transformation begins where noise ends. As long as the world is loud, the heart stays distracted. The mind races from thought to thought, the spirit remains cluttered, and the truth gets buried under the constant demand to respond, to react, to be heard. But when the noise stops, When the external voices fade and the internal chaos stills, something sacred begins. That is where transformation lives. Not in the shouting, not in the chaos, but in the still, undisturbed silence where nothing is left but honesty. It's difficult to change when you're surrounded by noise. Noise gives you an excuse. It tells you, there's no time to reflect. There's too much going on. Just keep moving, keep talking, keep filling the space. But transformation doesn't happen in motion, it happens in stillness. It doesn't come through performance, but through presence. And the moment the noise dies down, you start to see yourself clearly, not the version you've projected, not the one others expect, but the one that has always existed quietly underneath the surface. In silence, the mirror becomes sharper. In the absence of distraction, you hear your own breathing, you feel your own longing, and you begin to recognize how much you've ignored for the sake of staying comfortable. The noise might have convinced you that everything was fine, but the quiet begins to whisper what the noise kept hidden. It brings up the unfinished business, the buried wounds, the hidden desires, and the parts of yourself that have gone untouched for far too long. That is the starting point of true transformation. Awareness without denial. You can't change what you refuse to see. And in the noise, it's easy to look away. But in the quiet, there is nowhere to hide. Your thoughts become louder. Your emotions rise to the surface. The patterns you've justified begin to show their weight. And it's not always pretty. In fact, sometimes it's painful. But the pain isn't there to destroy. It's there to awaken. There is power in reaching the place where there is no one left to impress, no performance left to give, no validation left to chase. That is where the soul can breathe again. And in that breath, transformation begins to unfold, not as something forced, but as something remembered. The real you, the one not shaped by fear or applause or pressure, starts to emerge. And once that emergence begins, there's no going back. The noise can try to return, but it won't satisfy. It won't drown out the hunger that silence awakened. Change that's rooted in silence runs deeper. It doesn't just polish the surface, it reorders the foundation. It aligns your choices with your truth. It redirects your energy from proving to becoming. It restores clarity where confusion once ruled. And it begins to untangle you from the people, the patterns, and the mindsets that were never meant to hold you. This kind of transformation doesn't need a stage. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't ask for applause. It happens quietly, in the deep places, and often unseen by others. But you will know, you will feel the shift. You will sense the release. You will experience the strength that comes not from trying harder, but from letting go. Silence is not the absence of growth. It is the soil of it. What happens in stillness has the power to redefine your entire life, because it starts at the root. It doesn't patch the wound. It heals it. It doesn't cover the cracks. It rebuilds from within. And once that work begins, everything around you starts to change in response, not because you demanded it, but because you aligned with something deeper, something truer, something that noise could never give you. Silence creates space for conviction. God often speaks loudest in our quiet. There is a sound that cannot be heard with the ears, only with the spirit. It is the voice that moves beneath the noise, beneath the layers of daily life, beneath the whirlwind of opinions, fears, and expectations. It is the voice that is always speaking but rarely heard, because the soul is too crowded, too hurried, too distracted. We search for answers in voices around us, in opinions, in plans, in movement. But the clearest guidance comes not in the rush, but in the stillness. When everything else fades, when you quiet your soul, that is when his voice begins to rise. It is not that God is silent. It is that we often are not still enough to hear him. We expect him to compete with the world's volume, but he doesn't. His presence does not need to overpower, it invites, it waits. He speaks in whispers that move mountains. He speaks in nudges that shake hearts. But those whispers require room. Those nudges require surrender, and silence is the doorway that allows them in. There's something sacred about choosing to be quiet, not just outwardly, but inwardly. To lay down the need to be heard, to stop wrestling for control, to release the urge to explain or defend. In that space of release, something begins to unfold. What you could not see before becomes clear. What felt confusing becomes ordered. What weighed heavy begins to lift, not always all at once, but piece by piece, breath by breath, as your spirit opens up to something greater than your understanding. Many people search for God in thunder, in signs, in the grand and the loud. But the pattern has always been different. When Moses stepped away from the crowd, when Elijah went into the cave, when Jesus withdrew to the mountain, those were not retreats of weakness. They were returns to alignment, to listen, to be emptied, to be filled again. Because the presence of God is not found in the noise. It is found in the intimate spaces where hearts are open and words are few. It is in those spaces that God begins to reveal things you weren't ready to hear before. He shows you the motives behind your actions, the fears behind your control, the pain behind your silence. Not to shame, but to heal. Not to accuse, but to draw you closer. Because his voice always comes with both clarity and comfort. It reveals, but it also restores. And in your quiet, he does more than speak. He transforms. Silence is not about emptiness, it's about making room. Room for wisdom, room for presence, room for instruction. And often, in the moments where we feel most abandoned or alone, he is closest. Not always in the way we expected, not always in the language we wanted, but always present. Sometimes he speaks through peace that passes understanding. Sometimes through conviction that pierces deep. Sometimes through comfort that wraps around your spirit like a blanket. But always he is speaking in the quiet. When you stop trying to fill the silence, when you stop reaching for the next word, the next explanation, the next solution, you begin to feel a different kind of presence. One that doesn't rush, doesn't panic, doesn't condemn. One that waits with you. One that whispers wisdom when the time is right. One that reminds you who you are, not based on your past, but on his promise. That is where real faith begins to grow, not in the noise of striving, but in the quiet of surrender. That is where guidance becomes clear, not because you demanded it, but because you became still enough to receive it. There is something uniquely powerful about a space unfilled by words. When voices fall away, when opinions are set aside, and when the sound of explanation goes quiet, what remains is the raw and unfiltered environment where conviction can finally breathe. Conviction is not born in the noise, it is awakened in the pause. And that awakening is not soft, it is sharp. It presses on the conscience, it calls to the soul, and it refuses to be ignored. So long as the air is filled with talking, reasoning, defending, excusing, conviction stays buried. It waits in the background, crowded out by the need to be understood or justified. But once silence enters, it parts the noise like a sea. It clears the emotional debris, the mental clutter, and the social performance. It clears a path for something deeper to enter. In that path walks conviction, not as a punisher, but as a revealer. Conviction is not guilt. Guilt accuses, condemns, and pushes a person toward shame. Conviction invites, illuminates, and draws a person toward truth. And truth has a voice, but it often waits for quiet to speak. It doesn't compete with shouting. It doesn't demand attention. It waits for the soul to be still enough to hear it. That is why silence is necessary. It clears the way for that quiet, unwavering voice inside to rise and say what needs to be said. Not to others, but to oneself. When you go silent, especially in the presence of someone who has grown used to your voice, your corrections, your comfort, your explanations, that silence becomes an unfamiliar mirror. It reflects what they've done, what they've ignored, and who they've become. Not by accusation, but by exposure. They are left to sit with their thoughts, their decisions, and the truth of their own reflection. And in that stillness, conviction often takes its first breath. It is in the silence that the mind begins to retrace steps. Actions once dismissed as insignificant begin to echo with weight. Words once said carelessly return in memory, now sharper, more revealing. The heart begins to feel what it once ignored. The soul begins to stir with recognition. That stirring is not comfortable. Conviction rarely is. But it is honest. It does not attack. It awakens. Some resist it at first. They may try to reintroduce noise. They may provoke, accuse, or even mock the silence, hoping to restore the familiar chaos. But true silence, when held with strength and clarity, cannot be broken by noise. It remains, and in remaining it continues its work. It allows the pressure of truth to settle in. It gives time for the heart to hear what it couldn't while the noise was present. It gives conviction room to grow. And when conviction grows, transformation becomes possible. Not because someone told them what to do, but because they saw it themselves. They felt it. They knew it. And they couldn't unknow it. That is the gift of silence. It gives a person the chance to come to truth not by force, but by revelation. And when someone arrives at truth on their own, through the stillness, the change is deeper. It's not for show. It's not to appease, it's real. Conviction is not loud, but it is relentless. It does not need to scream to be heard, it only needs space. Silence gives it that space. It removes the barriers, strips away the noise and waits. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, sometimes longer. But once it takes root, conviction becomes a fire that can't be ignored. It moves through the soul, illuminating what's been dark and calling the person back to what they were meant to be. There is a difference between silence and absence. People often confuse the two, especially when they are desperate for reassurance. When someone stops speaking, the instinct is to believe they have stopped caring. When the conversation fades, the mind begins to weave stories of rejection, abandonment, and indifference. But silence is not always the absence of presence. It can be the most deliberate form of it. Silence is not void, it is often intentional. A pause is not the same as a disappearance, and quiet does not mean a heart has stopped feeling. There are moments in life when words are too fragile to carry the truth. There are times when what needs to be understood cannot be said. It must be felt, it must be discerned, and that kind of understanding can only rise when the noise recedes. Silence is not always avoidance, it is sometimes the most courageous choice. It says, I will no longer speak over what must be faced. It says, I am making room for reflection, not reaction. In that space, something ancient begins to stir, the part of the soul that has grown numb from too many words and not enough meaning. The presence that exists in silence is often more powerful than 1,000 explanations. The gaze that stays, the energy that doesn't withdraw, the spirit that remains connected even when the mouth is closed. This is not absence, it is substance. It is the quiet proof that real presence is not defined by sound, but by stillness. And in that stillness, you are asked to sit with yourself without the distraction of dialogue, without the crutch of being comforted. It is there, in that uncomfortable, unfiltered space, that truth begins to rise. The human heart is conditioned to associate silence with danger. From childhood, we panic in the quiet. We assume something is wrong. But the sacred teaches something different. The sacred teaches that in the quiet, there is revelation. In the absence of speaking, there is the presence of meaning, and that meaning often cannot be translated into words, because words would soften it, dilute it, or make it easier to avoid. But silence does not allow avoidance. It sits with you, quietly waiting until you are ready to face what you would not face while the sound was still there. When someone goes silent, the first impulse is to chase the noise again, to demand a response, to fill the space with pleas or explanations. But sometimes the silence is not meant to be broken. Sometimes it is meant to be honored. It is a space being held for reflection, for reckoning, for return. It is a gesture that says, I have said enough. Now it is your turn to see, and what must be seen cannot be described for you. It must be found within you. That is what silence does. It hands you the mirror. Silence speaks in ways noise never could. It is patient, it is watchful, it waits without pushing. It does not try to force growth, it makes room for it. And it is in that room that the real transformation begins. Not because someone told you what to do, but because you finally had the space to feel the weight of your own choices. That weight, that recognition is often the beginning of wisdom. Not the kind learned in books, but the kind etched into the soul through experience and stillness. Presence in silence is often mistaken for withdrawal because we are trained to measure love in volume. But real love is not always loud. Real love sometimes steps back so that healing can take its first breath. It sometimes removes its voice so yours can be heard. It sometimes chooses not to speak so that truth can rise without interruption. And when it does, that truth becomes undeniable, because it did not come from pressure. It came from presence, the kind that never left even when the voice did. Some lessons can only be learned in silence. There are teachings that no voice can carry, no sermon can preach, no book can write. They do not come to you by information but by revelation. And revelation does not shout. It does not arrive on command or fall neatly into a schedule. It unfolds when the soul has been stilled, when the striving has ceased, and when the need to be understood is finally laid down. In silence, the heart is exposed, not to be shamed, but to be shaped. In that sacred quiet, the lessons that eluded you in noise begin to rise from the deep. There are things you cannot learn while you're speaking. There are truths too holy for the crowded mind. They wait until you are emptied out, until all your arguments have grown tired, until your pride has run its course, until your self-justification has no breath left. And when you reach that still point, when the voice within you says nothing but listens, something begins to change. The ears of the spirit open, the inner eye begins to see. You are no longer trying to understand with your mind alone, you are beginning to perceive with your soul. People often seek wisdom in the opinions of others, hoping for clarity through conversation, validation through dialogue. But there are truths that will never be spoken to you by another human. They are meant for you and God alone. They are whispered in the stillness of a surrendered spirit. They do not come with fanfare but with a quiet weight, a sudden knowing, a conviction too precise to ignore and too sacred to explain. In that moment, you are not being taught in the traditional sense, you are being transformed. Silence is a refining fire, it burns away the excess. It reveals what is real. It strips you of the unnecessary so that you can finally see what is essential. That kind of clarity does not come when you are surrounded by noise, even if the noise sounds spiritual. It comes when all you have left is stillness and honesty. In that stillness, your wounds begin to speak. Your motives become visible. Your distractions lose their power. You see yourself, not as you have pretended to be, but as you are. And that vision is not meant to destroy you. It is meant to awaken you. Sometimes God will remove every external voice not to punish you, but to teach you how to hear the one voice that matters. When the applause stops, when the phone goes silent, when the answers stop coming from outside, that is when the real school begins. You are not being ignored, you are being enrolled. The silence is your classroom and the lesson is you. Who you are when no one is watching. What you believe when no one is validating you. What you carry when no one is helping you hold it. That kind of learning does not produce a certificate. It produces character. Some of the most profound revelations come not in the moment of speech but in the moments after. When the room has emptied, when the lights are off, when you're alone with what was said, and even more so with what was not. That space between what happened and what will happen next is where eternity often touches time. It is where you begin to realize what truly matters. It is where you begin to hear the faint echoes of a deeper truth. A truth that was always present, but buried beneath distraction. We fear silence because it feels like the unknown. But silence is not empty space. It is full of God's presence, full of unseen work, full of quiet miracles. It is the soil where understanding grows slowly but surely. And what is grown in silence lasts longer than what is shouted from the rooftops. Because it is rooted. It is watered by tears no one saw. It is nourished by humility no one applauded. It was learned in the dark, in the quiet, in the waiting, and therefore it cannot be taken from you by noise, by opinion, or by fear. When silence enters a man's life, it does not come to destroy. It comes to reveal. It strips away the noise that once masked the truth, pulls back the veil on what was hidden in plain sight, and invites the soul to listen in a way it never has before. In the stillness, he is confronted with himself, with God, and with the space between who he has been and who he is called to become. Every silence carries a question, a mirror, a choice. It is not a void but a holy pause rich with unseen movement. For the one who can sit with the silence and not rush to fill it, there is a strength formed that no applause can give and no man can take away. It is in that silence that a man finds what truly sustains him, what truly guides him, and what truly defines him. He no longer needs to be heard to know he has value. He no longer needs to speak to prove his presence. He carries the weight of stillness like armor, the kind forged not in performance but in private surrender. This is what happens to a man when you go silent. Not the end, but the beginning of something far deeper than words.